Well, I think it's important to give recognition to Helga for introducing sort of not only Friedrich Schiller but also Nicholas Cusa to our movement. And I was sitting in jail in Alexandria, and I got a request from a former member now to translate On Conjectures. And that particular piece I translated from German. That's what I have as a translation of German. And then that sort of got me to thinking that I would translate, basically those pieces which had not yet been translated, plus a few others like Pace Vide, which there were already existing translations. So I was able, they purchased a 3-volume set in Germany, which was the Latin and a German translation. And I had studied Latin in high school a very long time before I began this enterprise. And so I got some primers on Latin and Latin dictionary in order to refresh my Latin. And then use the German as basically a way to, as a guide, although I found in many places the German translation was not actually fully accurate. So I worked through the Latin, but with the German as a guide. So basically in all of that time, I essentially focused on first translating Joan of Arc, Schiller's Joan of Arc, and then translating Nicholas of Cusa. And the basic point is that Nicholas of Cusa, as Lynn has stressed, really is one of those minds that has shaped all of human history. You have Brunelleschi and Cusa. Obviously, you have Kepler, who was influenced, by the two of them, especially by Nicholas of Cusa, at least in terms of explicit references. And his contribution is just universal. It's in terms of science, in terms of the development of the nation state, in terms of being an inspiration for the rediscovery of the Western Hemisphere, in terms of a policy of peace based on an ecumenical approach among the world's religions, and not just religions, as I was saying today, but obviously also people who do not profess to a particular religion, such as Greek philosophers, among others. So I wanted to just focus on a few things in order to, and then maybe just and then get a discussion going. I mean, the first thing I would just really stress is the first writing major writing of Nicholas of Cusa was Concordancia Catholica, which is, you could actually translate as universal concordance. I actually didn't have a copy of this in Latin or German, and it was translated after the first publication of this came out after I got out of prison. But the basic idea there is that Nicholas of Cusa develops really the notion of a sovereign nation state. It's and the way he and of course the first sovereign nation state that we have is in France after Cusa's. It's a result of what Cusa actually did. And the basic idea that he puts forward there is that we were going to, at one point when Graham Lowry was still alive, there's a proposal for he and I to give a joint event with me discussing this question of the sovereign nation state and Graham in terms of the founding of America. Unfortunately, that didn't occur. But the basic point that he makes is that the rather than the ideology at that time, which basically you had the donation of Constantine, and the idea that the emperor derives his authority from the Pope, who was given this gift from to have that power, right? So it was that was the basic idea, and you had on the one hand the idea of that authority of the Pope, which was universal throughout the whole church, and then in opposition to that you had the conciliar movement, which came into existence really out of the phenomenon that during the Dark Ages and the 100 Years' War, there was a period in which you actually had 3 popes, and which made it a little bit difficult. So there was a council that was created, the Council of Constance. It was actually called by secular officials in order to force these popes to abdicate so that they could actually elect a single pope. So out of that fact that the popes were essentially forced by the nations, the nations were represented at this council. It was referred to as the representatives of the nations. You on the one hand, it's the beginning of it's a part of the development of the nation state. On the other hand, it led to the conciliarist movement, which had the Council of Basel. And at the Council of Basel, which was highly dominated by a certain faction from France, the basic idea was that the council had superiority over the Pope. Nicholas of Cusa made his first appearance at that council, and he wrote this book and submitted it at that council. And there are those who argue that Nicholas of Cusa therefore was a conciliarist and thought that the council was superior to the Pope. But even in here, what Nicholas of Cusa lays out is that the Council of Basel was illegitimate because they acted in opposition to the Pope. And so Cusa left the Council of Basel and went on behalf of Pope Eugene to Greece, where he organized representatives of the Orthodox Church and Platonic scientists from Greece to come to Florence for the ecumenical conference that was initiated by Eugene. And in here, though, the basic thrust of what he lays out is that the decision should really be made not by the Pope, but should actually be made by, and this is in reference to, because you didn't have nation states yet at this point. This is in reference to the actually the decisions in the church. He writes that matters should be settled where the matters arose. From that standpoint, there should be no appeals to a pope from a sentence of a national council. In other words, the national council would be the actual authority. His source for this was he went back, as he did in many cases, to original documents of the church, and he went back to the Nicene Council. The basic point that he discovered in those documents was that every issue which had arisen in Africa should be definitively determined by that council. So it was really a principle of self-determination that he was expressing even before you had the nation state. And it runs throughout this entire book, this concept. He says an appeal first from a council to a bishop, not to the Pope, but if necessary to the provincial synod or to the universal national councils of France, Spain, Germany. And that these councils should be reestablished out of zeal for the preservation of the commonwealth and the furtherance of national peace and mutual love. So that was the basic idea that he expressed. Now, at the same time, this book really expresses a conception of natural law, which is the basis for really the Declaration of Independence and and the Constitution. I have at least one, I'll just read one statement. This is from Catholic Concordance. All legislation is based on natural law, and any law which contradicts it cannot be valid. Hence, since natural law is naturally based on reason, all law is rooted by nature in the reason of man. All legitimate authority arises from elective concordance and free submission. There is in the people a divine seed by virtue of the common equal birth and the equal natural rights of all men, so that all authority which comes from God, as does man himself, is recognized as divine when it arises from the common consent of the subjects. It is the common opinion of all experts on the subject that the Roman people can take power to make laws away from the emperor because he derives his power from the people. When they order something contrary to a divine commandment, it is evident that the command does not share in the divine rulership, and one should not obey it. No one is obliged to observe an unjust law, and no living person is exempt from a just one. So, that's Nicholas of Cusa, and the basic conception is this free consent, elective consent, that the government has to be by the consent of the governed. And anything else is actually illegitimate. So this is a totally revolutionary concept, which did not exist. It was never expressed, to my knowledge, anywhere prior to Nicholas of Cusa. So you have both the concept of decisions should be made on a national basis, and this conception of natural law based on human reason. And if you look at the beginning of on Catholic Concordance, he makes the point that the only way that you can achieve peace and harmony in human society is to the extent to which all individuals rise to the level of harmony with the logos or the word, with creative reason. And throughout all of his writings, the point that he makes is that means rising above the level of sense perception, above the level of logical deduction, to the level of creative reason. And that is where harmony actually exists, on the basis of that principle. So that, that's the, and Nicholas of Cusa, is not somebody who is fully appreciated in the Catholic Church, particularly among those who were, confessed Aristotelians. He's not liked by synerchists whatsoever. The leading synerchist in Mexico, Pascal, actually told one of our organizers that LaRouche, must be a pantheist because he's promoting Nicholas of Cusa. And there were two lines against Nicholas of Cusa. He was a conciliarist, and that he was a pantheist, which is the furthest thing from the truth in both cases. And there were elements within our own organization, associated with Fernando Quijano and others of that ilk who actually shared that view of Nicholas of Cusa. So that's really a fundamental conception which leads into the American Revolution. And of course, the second conception, the second thing which leads into the American Revolution is, requires the existence of America and the rediscovery of the Western Hemisphere. So, as Lynn has stressed, you have the death of Nicholas of Cusa, 1464. The two people who were the executors of his last will and testament were Ferdinand Martin, the Bishop of Portugal, and Paolo Toscanelli. They were the executors of his last will and testament. And not only that, they were also participants in a number of his dialogues. Toscanelli is a participant in one of the dialogues on the Quadrature of the Circle. Ferdinand Martin is a participant in the dialogue on the Not Other. And also, when Nicholas of Cusa went to Greece on behalf of Eugene, in advance of the Council of Florence, one of the people he went with was directly related to Ferdinand Martin. I think he may have been a brother. but definitely a relative. So it was a tight circle of collaborators, and not, these are just not administrators who he named to be the executors of his will. They were participants intellectually in the endeavors that he was engaged in. And of course, so Columbus goes to Portugal, and he meets Ferdinand Martin. And Ferdinand Martin attempts to get support from the Portuguese government for Columbus's trip. And there's correspondence between Columbus and Toscanelli, including providing Columbus with a map that would help in terms of the trip westward. So, in that sense, this is really an extension of the discoveries of Nicholas of Cusa and of his intention. Because you read Unlearned Ignorance, it's very clear. He says that the Earth is spherical. It's not a perfect sphere, because there's no such perfection, but it's spherical. So there's no illusion here about, or delusion about the Earth being flat. This comes fundamentally from Nicholas of Cusa's view of the world. Now, okay, and then I think just also the De Pace Fidei, the thing I would say about that is, this was the subject of a seminar that just occurred in Munich. And the basic point here is that this came after the Turkish takeover of Constantinople, and Nicholas of Cusa's perspective at that point was to call for peace among different faiths. It really is the conception of unity in diversity. That various religions, as he put it, basically receive their rituals or their religious rites, differently. But there's a commonality, which is not a lowest common denominator, but rather is the commonality is the nature of man, as created by the Creator. So that when you go through this work, the key concept, which is shared by all human beings, whether they are actually of one religious denomination or another, or whether they have no religious denomination, which is agape, love for your neighbor. But that from the standpoint of also creative reason. It's the question of man created in the living image of the Creator is capable of creativity, creative reason, and agape is the determination to act on the basis of creative reason in behalf of humanity. And from that standpoint, all humanity should be able to unite in terms of the common destiny of mankind, to use a phrase which is quite prevalent among us at this point. Now, I think that the most important work of Nicholas of Cusa is on learned ignorance. And there was a companion piece which was on conjectures, and he refers to it in the text of On Learned Ignorance. But the real breakthrough is on learned ignorance. And I'm going to concentrate primarily on the second and third books. The first book, the main thing I would say about it is that what Nicholas of Cusa does in the first book is to compel you to rise to the level of thinking about God, to think in terms of that which is infinite, absolute infinite. So in a certain sense, what he's doing in the first book is getting you out of the level of induction or deduction, right, to the level of the coincidence of opposites. All right, he goes through an infinite line is the same as an infinite circle, it's the same as an infinite triangle, which blows away all of your conceptions from Euclidean geometry. All right, and you're basically forced to rise above induction, deduction, to creative reason, to think in your own mind. He uses mathematical symbols, but the point is that you have to go beyond mathematics to conceive of the infinite. Because there is no infinite triangle, there is no infinite line, there is no infinite circle. So he's using geometrical figures which don't exist to force you to think in terms of that which is infinite, which is the same thing as to say that which is not finite, that which is not created, but is the creator. So that, that's the first point. Now you go then into the second book. And the thing that's really incredible about Nicholas of Cusa is that that the conclusions he comes to are not based upon empirical evidence. They're not based upon empirical images or scientific measurements or anything of the sort. They derive from the human mind and from this conception of what is the difference between the absolute creator and that which is created in the world, as Plato puts it, a world of becoming. And so he starts out with simple, straightforward proposition that nothing created can be absolutely perfect. So what derives from that? Well, I mean, among the things he says is, well, if that which is created cannot be absolutely perfect, then in fact there can be no fixed point, which is, fixed immobile point in the universe. Essentially, everything that's created must move. Now, if you don't have a fixed point which is at rest, at perfect rest, then you don't have a center of a circle. And if you don't have a center of a circle, then you don't have a circumference that is perfectly circular. But because the circumference has to be equidistant from the center at all points. So from that, he comes very straightforwardly to the conclusion that there are no perfectly circular orbits. He doesn't come to the conclusion, as Kepler later does, that instead of circular they're elliptical. But it's a negative proof that they cannot possibly be perfectly circular. And of course, coming from this, you also have the notion that that the Earth moves. So what he's just done through that distinction, that conceptual distinction, is to blow Aristotle and Ptolemy completely out of the water. Let me just see if I can find a quote for you on this. Well, what he says is, he says, therefore the earth, which cannot be the center, cannot be devoid of all motion. Therefore, just as the earth is not the center of the world, so the sphere of fixed stars is not its circumference. He says the shape of the earth is spherical, and the motion is circular, but there could be a more perfect shape or motion in the created universe. As he said, the earth is not spherical, but it tends towards sphericity. Now, so right there you've got, you really lay the basis in a certain way for Kepler. It doesn't, again, it doesn't, it just totally devastates Ptolemy, Aristotle, and it basically, lays the basis for Kepler to develop the actual notion of orbits. But what it also does is, if you have no center of the universe and no circumference of the universe, his point is that God is the center and the circumference of the universe. And that God is everywhere, but nowhere in particular. In other words, he's not in one thing, but he's present pervasively in everything that's created. Now the other thing about this is that he also makes it very clear, he just destroys Euclid by saying that curvature follows from finitude. He says curvature follows upon finitude, since a line is curved because it is not the maximum line. For if it were the maximum line, it would not be curved. Right? So, I mean, if it were the maximum line, it would be infinitely straight. So therefore, he's established that that everything that's created is defined by curvature. I mean, it isn't. Yeah, there are obviously different curvatures, but the point is that is a fundamental point that he makes. So all of these developments are put forward in the second book, and really represent a complete revolution in scientific thinking about the universe. There's one more thing I want. Let me see if I can find this. Now the other thing is which is really quite something, is listen to this. There's one more passage that I've got to find. He really develops a conception of evolution, and actually uses the word evolution in doing so. I have it in here at some point. He says, the motion of the planets is an unrolling of the first motion, and the motion of temporal and terrestrial things is the unrolling of the motion of the planets. Now, the word for unrolling is evolutio. So it's evolution.
Also, entwicklung.
Yeah. So one of the fundamental ideas that Nicholas Cusa develops is that the creator enfolds in his mind all that which is unfolded in time in the created universe. So that it's the Entwicklung, development in terms of German, but it's in Latin it's evolutio. Right, and so that's the conception. I mean, think of what we've said in terms of even the question of the creation of the planets, the orbits, as essentially an unrolling of the first motion, right? And then it's the same kind of conception, and it's also, he develops this in terms of this is also in On Learned Ignorance. He says that in reference to the Earth, the Sun, and other things, unless they had been latently present in matter, present in terms of a certain contracted possibility, there would have been no more reason why they would have been brought forth into actuality than not. So what he's saying is that the actual further evolution of created nature is latent in the possibility, the potentiality, which already exists in matter. And he continues, certain causes of coming events are latent in terrestrial things, as the produce is latent in the seed. Hence, these thinkers said that things enfolded in the world soul, as in a ball, are unfolded and extended through such motion. And it was a conference, I think it was 1993, I did a presentation on Nicholas Cusa and the concept of neg entropy, or anti-entropy. And, you know, the person that I think Helga was introduced to Nicholas Cusa by was a German professor by the name of Haupst. And he wrote on this as well, in terms of this conception of evolution, which is anti-entropic. Because what you also get in the second book of On Learned Ignorance is the conception that the world machine does not perish. You know, that, and I think the other point is, not only does it not perish, but it is susceptible to further development, and that's the mission of man. right? That man is this is now the third book, and this is the most difficult book for a lot of people because it's put in terms of, it's put in Christian theological terms. But you have to, with everything with Nicholas of Cusa, you've got to think. If you happen to have a prejudice against that, put it aside. Think it through from the standpoint of what he's arguing intellectually and intelligibly. Because the fundamental concept he operates from he's trying to explain is the beginning of the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. The Word being the Logos, or right? And all things are made through the Word, and the Word then became flesh, which is Christ. So he identifies Christ with the Word, the Logos. And it's very important because it's saying something about humanity. That in other words, it goes right to the heart of the conception of man, that he is that he is a second God, that he is a microcosm, and he has a responsibility for the further development of that which is latent in the creation. So when you think in terms of Croft Erica with the extraterritorial imperative, if you think of Bernansky, in Russia, Nicholas of Cusa is called Kuzansky. He's very well known in certain circles in Russia, I'm sure by Bernansky as well. So the basic point is when he's discussing the noosphere and the noetic quality of the mind, and how man is a geological force, this ultimately comes from this conception of Nicholas of Cusa of man as a microcosm. And man, because what he's dealing with is the notion ostensibly of Christ as God-man. Right? But the concept is that man has this divine mission. And what makes his mission possible? His creative intellect. That's the way in which he's in the image of the living image of the Creator. So it's the thing about Nicholas of Cusa is that he really fights to make everything intelligible, which others accept with blind faith as an article of doctrine. Right? Or a very simple thing. I mean, if in Christian theology you have the concept of the Trinity, and if man is created in the living image of the Creator, then that's got to be reflected in the human mind. Augustine made this put forward this idea, and it's expressed in different kinds of ways, but you have that you have God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, right? And it can be, it's expressed in different ways. That the Father is memory, you have the Logos is creative reason, and the Holy Spirit is agape, or determination. But go back to Plato. Plato argues that which is eternal is self-moving. In other words, if something is self-moving, it is only something which is self-moving is eternal. And that's the human mind, insofar as it is operating in the living image of the Creator as created. That's something which is eternal, because it's not something which is moved from the outside. And so this conception of this Trinitarian conception, Cusa develops from that standpoint, that it's self-moving. The soul is self-moving. And of course he argues that the soul is the power of reason. He's very explicit on that. As he says, although the motion that gives life to the animal ceases with the declining health of the body, nevertheless the intellectual motion of the human soul, which exists and functions without the body, does not cease. For this reason, that motion, which intellectually moves itself, is self-subsistent and substantial. That motion which is not self-moving is an accident, but that motion which is self-moving is substance. Now, all right, then let me just go, and I mentioned during the presentation this afternoon that you've got a where he, not only does he say the world machine cannot perish, but he also at one point talks about man, and he says the whole resurrected man is his intellect. And he says, that basically that God so inwardly united the Word of God the Father that the Word would be human nature's center of existence. And I'm just trying to find this other thing which I quoted, which is that basically without man, the universe would not exist. It wouldn't be, the universe would not be perfect, and in fact it wouldn't exist. That's actually what he says. So what you have here is really everything that Lynn and Helga have emphasized in terms of the actual nature of man. And if you look at Nicholas of Cusa, everything that he does is really a paradoxical metaphor. There's a whole series of them. For instance, he'll argue that if you become an adopted son of God, right? The idea being Christ is the Son of God, and everybody else can become an adopted son or daughter of God. And the basic point that he makes is that you do that by rising to the level of creative reason. And when you rise to the level of creative reason, you are actually in a domain which is characterized as timeless time. Right? You're really free of images and sense perceptions and logical deductions, and you're in a timeless realm. You're actually you're in simultaneity of eternity, even as you still exist in time. Or the other conception which he has, which is that man is a finite infinite. Which you also find in Friedrich Schiller in the Letters on the Aesthetical Education of Man. Man is finite, but he is also infinite. Not infinite in the sense of absolute infinite with respect to God, but he is a finite infinite. So you have this paradox, right? I mean, this is a certain kind of coincidence of opposites. How can you be finite and infinite at the same time? That violates the law of contradiction. How can you be timeless and in time? It violates Aristotle's law of contradiction. How can you be at rest and motion at the same time? Again, it contradicts Aristotle. This is something that he develops in. I'm not sure I'll go through this right now, but in Actual Potential, he has this image of a top, and the top of the top is rotating, at an absolute velocity, and it represents eternity. And you project down to a circle on a plane, which is in time. And the point he's making is that the circle that's rotating at absolute velocity is actually, it's in motion, but it's at rest. You can't distinguish between the parts of the circle because it's absolute velocity. And therefore, any point on this circle at the top projected down, right? All the points in eternity are simultaneously present in any point in time. So he's getting at this concept of the simultaneity of eternity, and that God is everywhere but nowhere in particular. He's not, he can't be confined to a particular, but it's everywhere. It's all pervasive. Simultaneity of eternity embraces all time. Or now, the other question is the not other, which is also expression of this notion of self-movement. Because what he wants to get to is how do you define God, who's not created? And how can you get a self-definition? So the self-definition is the not other is not other than not other. So it's not anything created. It's not a predicate. It defines itself. It also happens to be Trinitarian, and it also happens to be self-moving. And then what you do is you say, okay, well, everything created is other. But even the other is not other than other. So the cause of the other is not other. All right, so you have the idea that God is not, the not other is not other than not other. And then even that which is created, which is other, is not other than other. The otherness is defined by the not other. It's its cause. Now, all right, then I think the final thing I'll just go into is the quadrants of the circle, because this is something that Lynn identified as very, very significant. And I mean, people generally know this, but the, I think it was controversial in a certain sense when Lynn said that Nicholas of Cusa really superseded Archimedes in terms of his notion of the quadrant circle. And the basic point that Nicholas of Cusa arrives at is that the circle is a different species than a polygon. Therefore, okay, you have the Pythagorean theorem, which essentially defines a certain incommensurability between the diagonal and a length of the square in terms of x equals square root 2, and that's referred to as an irrational. But pi is not an irrational in that sense, because the circle and the polygon are not comparable, because the circle is actually transcendent in respect to the polygon. And that's the basic point. So I think if you really look at this, I mean, I think also the whole question of economics derives from some of these conceptions. The conception of evolution of that which is latent in things as mediated through the creative discoveries of human beings as the microcosm of the universe, with a responsibility for developing that universe. And then you have this conception of the circle, or circular action, as a different species which is ontologically superior to linearity. And that leads really into the concept of a succession of transfinite higher order conceptions that which define progress economically, with scientific breakthroughs which lead then to higher order forms of technology. Redefine your resource base. And so that, I think it really comes out of this question of the quadrant of the circle, and this conception of unfolding that which is enfolded in the mind of the creator. There was something which Lynn wrote on this. What he pointed, I'll just read this. What he pointed out is that the Greeks had discovered incommensurability. They knew, for instance, that the diagonal of the square is incommensurate with the side. Archimedes believed that pi was similarly an irrational magnitude. But what Cusanus established is that whereas the relationship of the diagonal to the side of the square is irrational, the relationship of the circle to the square is transcendental. And what Lynn wrote, that's just the argument in this particular article that I made. But then it quotes from Lynn. He writes, what Cusanus did was to recognize that pi is not ontologically an irrational, but a number of a higher ontological type than irrationals of a higher species. So that's the, I think if you combine those, those two concepts, that it really gives you the basis for an anti-entropic economy. So I think what I'd like to do is just basically open up for any discussion or questions. 'Cause I just wanted to pose certain key concepts so that, because I don't think all of this is completely unnew to people over an extended period of time. So maybe there are questions or, or further contributions that people want to make.
Well,
Where should we? Okay, and then.
all right.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay, real quick, when you think about what's going on in society and what Cusa is talking about and so forth, trying to bring mankind together regardless of their differences and so forth, and you think in terms of the idea of in the society where people think that, what defines who they are, the clothes they wear, the money they have, all of these things, and which they try to hang on to. But what you see, what's happening now, everything, all of that is just breaking down.
Well, that's why we need a new paradigm. And that's the paradigm, the paradigm that we're talking about today is a reflection of the new paradigm of the Renaissance, which Nicholas of Cusa was, along with others, was directly involved in, creating. And that's its significance today.
I had a couple things. First was on when you were talking about the Council of Basel, and that Cusa said it was illegal or illegitimate because it was against the will of the Pope. But in the document, in the Concordancia, he's talking about, as I understand what you're saying, power deriving from the consent of the governed. So where does the power of the Pope come from in that idea?
Well, it's basically, he has a certain authority, that derives from, it should basically derive from his being, I don't know that he actually lays that out. What he doesn't lay that out specifically. He does lay out actually, he goes through a whole description of elections. This is a period, there are no elections in the 1400s. And so he goes through a very explicit description of elections of the Pope. So in a certain sense, the government, by the consent of the government, is the fact that he's elected.
Was he elected by the cardinals then? Is that something that's...
Yeah, that's what Cusa actually is describing in Concordancia Catholica, is an actual, he goes through, ballots in terms of how it should be done. But his basic idea is that, goes back to this idea that it has to be harmony, in the logos, in the word, reason. So that the vote has to be done on the basis of, really being in harmony with the logos, creativity, and the Holy Spirit. That's the basic idea. So, because the other issue that he raises is that, you're talking about a society in which people are totally uneducated.
It's not a democracy he's pushing, in other words.
No, he's not. No, what he's saying is the opposite. He says that the problem is that the number of fools is infinite. I often quote that because that's the problem. And what do you have? You have 100. He's coming out of a period of 100 years war, period of complete, serfdom, where people are uneducated. The only exception to that was the Brothers of the Common Life, which began a process of educating, basically orphans and young people, poor people. And Cusa and Erasmus were both products of that kind of process. But the point that he's addressing is that no, it's not a question of democracy, because the number of fools is infinite. that in order to have consent of the governed and that consent to be actually productive for humanity, people have to rise the level of creative reason. So it's a commitment to the development of the mental powers of the population to realize that conception. But the idea is that the government has to be through free, I think one of the terms is free submission. And of course he uses the example of Christ who, before being crucified, at Gethsemane says, "Thy will be done," or Mary who says, "Thy will be done," that she's going to bear Christ. So it's this. His conception is that man is by nature free, right? But so therefore you have to have government by free selection, and this also applies to the election of a pope. In terms of the Council of Basel, the point he was making is that if there is a disagreement between the elected pope and a council, then the Holy Spirit is not present, and therefore the council is invalid. And that's the point to be made, which flows from this. I mean, that's in this book on Catholic Concordance.
The other question I have is on this idea of nothing created is perfect. So you think of, well, how could the Creator, who we think of as perfection, create something which is not perfect? But is that's because of this idea of unfolding, that it's a latent, you could say it's like a latent perfection that's constantly unfolding from what is created.
Except that it'll never become absolutely perfect.
Perfect, right.
Right, that's the whole point. It's really the difference in a certain sense between cause and effect, which is also the question of circular action versus a polygon. The polygon is derived from the circular action as the cause. And in all of his writings, he basically says that if you want to know yourself, you need to know your cause. So so the question of created nature, created universe, is that it is capable of further perfection, but it can never achieve. It's not God, which proves that he wasn't a pantheist. Because the pantheists would say that the universe, that's all there is. It's just the universe and so forth. But there's that difference, which is the reputation of the pantheists.
Well, it was a very long time before I could read the third book of Dr. Ignorancia. I mean, every time I started, I said, I can't believe this, and I just put it down. And but it was very interesting to see the circumstances in which suddenly I really wanted to read it and saw something, finally understood what I thought he was getting at, or which is why with it's sort of like in the not other. There is definitely a poetic element of driving to a point that you have to submit yourself to experience what he's addressing. And it was in the context of a discussion we were having about the Passion of St. John. And I won't go through all the details. The way I began to understand it was by seeing him through Bach. And but the thing, I think one of the things that's there that he didn't mention, which really struck me very hard, is that the reason he chose this pedagogy as a way of getting it across, because it's not obvious if you have no religious background. And what really struck me is that he's working through this concept of, why did Mary have to be a virgin? Why all of, and he keeps saying, because Christ was perfect, because Christ was the highest level, because Christ was the highest level. And what's actually being demonstrated, it seems to me, and I can't replicate verbally the process he puts you through, but what he's actually demonstrating is that it's something that Lynn has said for a long time, that it is the nature of the human species thus far that its development depends upon leadership. That it's not as if the human species sort of develops biologically I don't know how animals change from one species to another or whatever, but that it's not a question of snapping, you know, where the entire human species suddenly snaps upward to a higher level, but that there has to be a process of exemplification of the highest level that mankind is capable of in order for the next level to come into being. That there always has to be this process of the highest level of thinking, the highest achievement, the highest expression of what it is to be human, to be able to find, to discover the next domain. And that this is what the existence of Christ actually embodied for all of mankind. And as I began to get absorbed by this, it really was a very powerful idea, and there was no problem with his pedagogy any longer. Because I think, and it comes back to what you were saying about evolution, that he's actually presenting a developmental, evolutionary, revolutionary concept of what which we're talking about now, about the new paradigm. Because it's not like, you know, somebody flips a switch and all of a sudden everybody gets up to a higher level of thinking or something like that. There has to be a process, and that it's exemplified by an individual. Sort of like the way Lynn is talking about Putin right now. That there has to be this kind of exemplification in society of reaching the highest level of thinking in order for the next level to be hypothesized. I just like to present that as because I think it's embedded in the choice of how he presented the idea that this concept is embedded in that.
Think about, you know, when the beginning of John, the Apostle John, Gospel
Well,
according to St. John.
we were discussing the Passion according to St. John.
No, I know. Yeah, and the in the Word, you know, in the Word was the beginning, and the Word was with God, and all things were created through the Word, and the Word then became flesh. It's manifested in a human form. That's the issue, and the further implication is that the further development of all things is through the Word, which has manifested itself, has become incarnate. So what's being attributed through this theology to man is not just that, you know, okay, all things are created by the Creator in the form of the Word, but it's saying that all things are actually created through the highest humanity. And in the third book, he often says that if you rise to the level of creative reason, and I mean, he puts it as a concept in Christianity called formed faith, because in the letters of James, he basically says if you have faith but are without love, it's basically that's formless faith, because it doesn't have the form of love, and that's empty. That's nothing. So formed faith is the idea that you have a faith which acts on the basis of love, which is the passion. And the point is that he makes is that if you have such formed faith, if you don't have it, then you basically are crippling yourself to the point where you're never going to, if you don't believe, in other words, if you don't believe in the power of the human mind, you're not going to be able to create anything because you've already discounted it. It's that same concept. So the point he makes is that people who operate on the basis of that formed faith in creative reason and act on that basis are actually Christ. He's within them while being at the same time numerically distinct. Let me see if I can find one of these quotes on that, because for the maximality of human nature brings it about that in the case of each man who cleaves to Christ through formed faith, Christ is this very man by means of the most perfect union, the numerical distinctness of each being preserved. So you're not Christ but in fact, that you share in this power of the Logos to the extent to which you have formed faith in that power for the good. So it's a concept which is just very, very powerful. Of course, there are those Aristotelians who would go berserk and do go berserk over this kind of concept. But that's the idea. And then there's this quote which I very often reference because I think it's very powerful. And what he says, essentially, he says, accordingly, since the intellect is of a nature which is convertible towards the intelligible, it understands only universal, incorruptible, abiding things. And I think that's for Nicholas of Cusa, to be converted is to be converted to the intelligible and to creativity. And he says, and if man's intellect, well, this is the introduction. And if man's intellect is so converted, he can have power over things over all things not in union with Christ. That is not operating on the basis of creative reason. So here's the quote: if the believer's faith is whole, then the power of Jesus, with whom he is united, he commands. If the believer's faith is whole, then with the power of Jesus, with whom he is united, he commands even the evil spirits and has power over nature and motion. And it is not he himself, but rather Jesus, who, in him and through him, works wondrous things, as the deeds of the saints bear witness. So he's saying that, you can set aside, in a certain sense, the Christian terminology and theology. What he's saying is that if you act with firm belief in the power of the Logos and act with love, then that Logos is actually acting in and through you. And you have power over that which is contrary to the Logos and to agape. Whether that be evil forces, like the British Empire, or which raises the Putin issue because he's operating on this level, or our movement, Lynn and Helga. It also gives you power over nature and motion. It gives you power over, to transform the physical universe. Whether that be helium-3 on the moon, or space travel with fusion power. You have the power to transform nature, to develop what is latent in it, but which would not actually be developed without man. Helium-3 is not going to become fusion power without man. So it basically is a conception of the power of man if he's operating, Augustine has this discussion of the coherence of science and faith, and the point that he makes is that faith is an intellectual assent. You're giving assent. Because you can't, so it's different than all of the so-called religion and all of the nonsense. You're talking about, a very, this is the power coming out of the Renaissance. These ideas, that's the power that resulted in the exponential increase in population density on the planet Earth.
I'm just adding one thing that
Yeah.
though, which I think is completely consistent with Lynn's approach
Yeah.
to revolution, to the way he's governed his existence and his process of development, which is that that people have that mankind actually successfully advances when there's a recognition or a resonance which enables people to identify a higher principle, and that higher principle can only exist if it is given expression by a concrete human being. So obviously it can be an assembly of human beings, but that the critical idea is the exemplification of Christ as both God and man, as representing the concreteness, that this has to be embodied in an actual actual human being. That democracy, in other words, that just democratic assent to, when people can assent to all kinds of things which they spiritually believe are valid and they're not.
Right.
You know, in other words, that there has to be some kind of, that the universe actually selects, pre-selects even before the individual exists, what is the type that would achieve this. I mean, it's a little, I'm not ready to really express this completely. It's not an easiest thing to address, which is why I think he uses the kind of pedagogy that he does. But you know, that in order for that to actually be, I'm thinking also about, you know, the way this works in China, for example, is very interesting, because you do get a resonance in huge numbers of people who are very different from each other, where they will work in a harmonious way going towards something, but that involves a certain quality of exemplification in particular people, but also like the way that they're bringing Confucius back right now to strengthen this process that's going on in the population, and how this has a unifying effect. That it has to be, that this quality has to be embodied in an actual person. You know, Lynn will often say, as he said this morning, use my name, use my voice, and that this is a very powerful effect, which is a radiation of what is exemplified in the validity of what Cusa is saying in the third book. That Christ exemplifies this principle. That's what I'm saying. It's not an abstract thing of people just suddenly declaring, you know, I have faith, I have formed faith, I love the human race, and I'm perfect, you know, I'm like Christ. Okay, and the psychiatrists are coming, you know. I mean, you know,
there are definite criteria.
There are criteria, and in the development of mankind, this has required an actual exemplification in a personality which has comprehension on this level. Otherwise, it doesn't exist. It's not real. And I think that's why he used that pedagogy, because you have to ask yourself these really funny questions, like, you know, why did Mary have to be a virgin? Yeah. You know, which, when you're not Catholic or Protestant, and you know, and everything else, you're sitting there going, come on, this is like the smartest guy in the world, and he's asking you that I have to accept this, and he's not saying I have to convert to Christianity, and you're sitting there. But if you actually get into the pedagogy, it becomes clear, because it's this question of absolute perfection, that this has to exist in society as a concept, and it is embodied in an actual living personality. You know, it's not just the reason it came up. The reason it came up is because we started.
Other people have questions.
Okay, well, that's fine. That's fine. I mean.
No, go ahead.
The reason.
I guess maybe, I don't know whether we have time or not, but I agree with you, and actually, in a certain sense, I mean, that's the whole point. That individuals have the capacity to access this power. I mean, it's the whole concept of imitation of Christ.
Right.
And remember, in the Alexandria trial, Lynn referenced Gethsemane. And he used to reference that an awful lot.
Yeah, it's in New Hampshire.
Right.
That's what happened.
Yeah.
Cretan Zoakis
You know,
walked out.
And because Cretan Zoakis didn't think it was a repeatable act, and therefore
Right,
nobody
exactly.
should try to imitate Christ. And certainly he wasn't going to.
He couldn't even imitate Cretan Zoakis.
But what is that concept? It's the concept you're talking about. And in a certain sense, the point is, you know, think about what Cusa is writing in the third book when you listen or participate in a performance of, you know, St. John's Passion or any, you know, really sacred music, whether it's, you know, literally sacred music or it's just sacred because it's, you know, beautiful music. That's the conception that you're operating on. And the idea is, you know, that all human, there is a Christ. It's not something arbitrary, but that all human beings are capable, maybe to different degrees, you know, and you know, realize this quality in different, you know, to different degrees. Certainly Lynn has that quality, Helga has that quality, Putin has that quality. Great musicians, you know, Beethoven or Bach, they have this quality in what they're producing. And that's the quality that's required to defeat evil and exercise power over nature and motion in the universe for mankind, for this mission that we have, to further the development of what is latent in this universe. But it's a human quality that he's getting at. It's the highest expression of humanity that you know, he's trying to make intelligible for people so that they can access that in themselves. You know, he says, you know, since there's no center and no circumference, it's not that, you know, that God is on the, you know, outside the universe, on the circumference of the universe. The kingdom of God is within men as well. It's that power of reason. That's Lynn's book, Power of Reason.
Exactly.
Ernie, or
I have a question.
yeah.
Well, I just
Oh,
had a quick question
yeah.
about what you know about Jan Hus, who I know was burned at the stake in 1415, and on the basis of challenging the authority of the Pope and the Church. And the one specific thing that I know about was he argued that it was possible for the individual congregant to have a direct relationship with God, and argued that they should be able to participate in the communion as opposed to it simply being the priesthood that had the inside track to God, and then on the basis of that told everybody else how to, you know, live their life.
Right.
So I was just, he's in this period, so I was wondering if you.
Well, it was one of the issues that was addressed at the Council of Basel. But I actually can't, I don't really, I'm not absolutely familiar with that. So, you know, rather than me talking about something I don't know, I prefer not to talk about it. So, I'm not, Dennis?
Yeah, this, I think might be useful to pose an hypothesis whether there is any idea in any language, the idea that is an idea, that can be expressed in anything other than a Trinitarian form. I think the answer is no.
Right. It'd be hard to construct a sentence.
What would that mean? I'm not clear
It
on
means
what
Well-
that nothing that is expressible could be expressed in anything other than a Trinitarian form.
I know, but what do you mean?
It means that
That's not-
everything is
That's not
3-1.
clear to me what that would mean.
Well, just try doing it.
Give me an example.
Okay, you have, what do you want to
Well,
do?
give me an example. As Trinitarian. Well, you know, most sentences are built around, well, actually you have, you know, you have a verbal action.
Right.
You have a sentence. You also have a subject,
Subject, verb, pronoun.
right? And you have, you know, a direct or indirect object. So it's,
Yeah.
huh?
In the third book, he talks about how the human individual has access to the pure intellect, that the reason operates between the senses and the pure intellect.
Right.
So that's Trinitarian.
Right, what we're trying to get at least what I'm trying to get at, is that nothing is expressible, which is not Trinitarian.
But I assume you mean there's something more to that than just subject, verb, object. I'm not.
Any idea that you can have about anything of any type has to be expressed that way. That the issue of the Trinity is an ontological issue. It's not a theological issue. It's ontological. It's embedded in the nature of thought.
Emerson gets at that even in the beginning of the 7 types. So you can, even with a simple statement, there's something acting on that simple statement itself, which that simple statement is a representation of.
Now, it could be wrong, so you should work on it if you, but
Well, yeah, because the question that came to my mind is, are you saying that a musical idea is Trinitarian?
I'm saying
Any
any
idea.
idea
Yeah.
ever expressed
Well, that's
by
something to
any
think
human
about.
being at any time, before, after, or in the future, nothing other than Trinitarian.
Well, this also goes to Plato, is that, you know, you don't have to, this was way before Nicholas Cusa and Christianity. In the Phaedrus, he develops this concept of that which is eternal, is self-moving. And something which is a you know, a stationary one is not self-moving. It has to, it's this conception from the not-other, something which is self-defining.
I had a question.
Wait, Ernie.
Oh,
Yeah, I had a question. It's really situating how you would situate Cusa in the history of science from a certain standpoint. I'm thinking about the notion of formative causation. You used to talk about efficient cause, final cause, and formal cause. And in a way, it's related to the idea, but I think you find it in Plato. He talks about, you know, in Parmenides, elsewhere, he talks about everything has its form, whether it's an idea or, and I think also material things. They have their archetypes. Now, you see that in biology today with Wertz, the idea that the development, you know, morphogenesis involves a kind of he called it dynamic preform morph. In other words, it's kind of a form that guides or somehow directs. It's not through energy, but by some other means that guides the development of, you know, embryogenesis. So this is sort of a modern version of that. And I've seen in Cusa's writings, he talks about forms, but I'm not quite clear
Well,
what is that, whether that's the same notion at all. I'm not at all clear whether it's like the modern notion, whether it's more like Plato, where you would situate it. You know, what is our hypothesis that it represents?
Well, in the second book, one of the polemics he develops is against the Neoplatonic idea of forms which are sort of disembodied, you know, up there in the sky, divorced from. And he basically says that these forms exist in the mind of God, and they're expressed in the actual, you know, created nature. They're not. There's not, like you have with Proclus or some of the other Plotinus, these archetypes or you know, forms. The cause is, the first cause is God, the Creator. The Plato's idea of eternal ideas are in the mind of God, and they're expressed in the material, in the physical universe. But there's no intermediate, you know, expression of these. So in other words, it's a polemic against that Neoplatonic conception. That's expressed in the second book of On Learning Ignorance. But you know, I'm not sure that I can answer that question otherwise, in terms of these different types of causality that you're discussing. I'm not sure. I have to think about it.
Oh, that's good. Okay. Maybe you can come up with something a little more. Because you see in Kepler, he talks about the forms that can directly, apparently, that determine the growth of plants. Okay? And he does that. That's in book 4. He talks about that. And in relationship, also, it seems to be the archetype in the mind that allows people and animals to respond directly to harmony. So he seems to have a certain notion of forms. And then he definitely has an archetype, you know, in terms of the, you know, the musical scales as an archetype, and also the solids. So this is, in other words, this is an idea that has a certain historical continuity, and I'm asking, you know, if this modern idea is somehow actually represents the same kind of, an attempt to answer the same kind of question. People,
You know,
goes further back.
You know, I'll just have to think about it. I can't.
Okay.
Can't immediately respond.
Need to ask a question.
I don't know anything about what during Cusa's time was the relationship between the Eastern civilizations and Christianity at that point, and how Cusa's idea of Christianity would change that interaction, or if Cusa studied anything.
You know, I don't know if he had any knowledge of Chinese.
Or even Islamic.
Yeah, he had knowledge of Islam, yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of, I mean, there's a lot of Islamic, you know, influence in that whole period. You know, besides the, I mean, obviously you have the translation of, well, really the only work of Plato that was translated was Timaeus. By, you know, which they got from the Arabs. It was translated, I guess, into Latin. So I think he was aware of, and of course, you know, you have a lot of the Arab influence even back into Charlemagne, and of course, you know, even back into, Hohenstaufen, Friedrich Hohenstaufen, because they're based in Sicily, so that, you know, he was fluent in, this is an earlier period, talking about 1100, he was fluent in Arabic.
Was he in dialogue with somebody, some people?
This guy, yeah, he was the
Cusa.
emperor. No,
Oh.
in terms of Cusa, I don't know to what extent he was in dialogue with anybody at that particular time. The major thing that he did is he went directly to Greece and brought back the original documents of Plato, which had, so that they could be translated. So that's really how you got the translation of all the rest of Plato. But what I'm saying is that you had there were earlier periods in Europe where there was a lot of interaction. Like the Hohenstaufen when he was emperor was based in Sicily, so you had Greek influence, you had Arab influence, Italian influence. I think he was fluent in a number of languages, including Arabic. And in that case, the church at that point wanted him to carry out a crusade in Jerusalem, and he initially refused. And he actually went on one trip and aborted the trip and came back saying that he was sick. So he was excommunicated by the Pope. I think he was excommunicated a few times. And then finally, because he spoke and wrote Arabic. So eventually, what happened is he and the Muslim leader at that point worked out a deal where he could go to Jerusalem, but there was no fighting. It was just that they worked out a deal between them, so that he could say that he carried out a crusade, but and not get excommunicated, but there was no. It was just they negotiated a settlement to this.
I just one thing, Will, is that if I'm not mistaken, Cusa was in touch with a number of scholars that he met at the Great Council, the Council of Basel, who were from Spain, who were directly in touch.
Because of the
in
Andalusian
Arabic.
Renaissance?
Excuse me?
Or the Moorish or Andalusian Renaissance, or?
Well, it would be from Spain. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
That was still.
I know of that as
yeah.
one particular
Yeah.
indirectly.
Yeah, and you have to realize that he wasn't actually at the Council of Florence. He brought the Greeks back, but then the Pope sent him to Germany to basically, make sure that the German princes didn't support the Council of Basel, which had excommunicated the Pope, right? And so essentially they elected an anti-pope at Basel. So he was deployed to Germany to basically make sure that Germans didn't go with the anti-pope. And that was quite successful. When he came back from that, Council of Florence had occurred, but clearly he helped shape it by everything he did. And a lot of his allies were there. But he eventually became he was deployed to Brixen, which is in Tyrol, I think. It's on the border of Italy and Austria. I'm not sure which country it's in.
It's still not clear.
Well, when I was a student in Vienna, I woke up one morning and I saw a newspaper that no, I didn't see the newspaper. They seized all the newspapers because there was something about Tyrolean independence, and it was. I guess that passed me by, but it sort of shocked me. But he was there. He was jailed by the local prince, So he was there, Brixton, jailed, you know, so he's another political prisoner. And then eventually he came back to Rome, and the Pope at that time made him the Vicar General of the Catholic Church, which is basically is the position. In that position, you're head of the Catholic Church in the absence of the Pope. So so you have this person was in that role in the
Vice
Catholic
Pope.
Church. Yeah, essentially.
Vice Pope.
And he also wanted to hold a synod on general reformation of the church, because he thought, correctly, that the church was completely, corrupt otherwise. So he held a synod, but the problem was that they were so corrupted they just laughed at him. So his proposal didn't didn't get put into effect. You can read his proposal; it's a very simple thing. It essentially wants to eliminate all superstition, eliminate, making money on
Indulgences?
I don't know whether it may have been the indulgence, but also on artifacts that were allegedly, bones of saints and all this stuff. And the basic idea was that he wanted to send out representatives from the church to all the local churches, the visitations that would actually inspect these churches to see what they were actually doing, teaching and so forth. And the whole thing was based on his proposal was based on the Beatitudes in terms of what the nature, of the clergy should be. So it was rejected, and as a result of that, you had the further degeneration into the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, and the Council of Trent, which was completely Aristotelian. So that's what he was actually doing. And if people don't know it, he's actually buried in two places. His burial spot is in a church in Rome, which is St. Peter's in Chains. St. Peter in Chains, right, where St. Peter is liberated from prison by an angel, and you have it's a bas relief in the prison. It's got Peter in the middle, an angel, and Nicholas of Cusa. Because, from the standpoint that he in his work set out to liberate the Catholic Church from what it had otherwise become. But then his heart is buried in Bernkastel Cruz, which is where he was born.
We should take a
I don't
break.
necessarily recommend it, but it's
What do you mean?
yeah, okay, so
It's a good start.